My name's Al Frisbee, and I was recently a city councilman in Marion. I just gave that up last night after 8 years. I see a lot of city council people. Would you raise your hand, please, if you're in city council? Look at all those people. Thank you very much for being here. Ed and I got together, maybe 3 or 4 months ago at a gathering, and I leaned over and said, Ed, would you like to present this to a number of people? And we'll get you going. I have access to about 950 people. This is how many show up. So what does that tell you? So Ed said, sure, be glad to talk about the hypothetical dark store theory. And I really didn't know that much about it. Neil is here. He's on the city council, and he knows quite a bit about it. So we're going to get these two guys to talk and ask questions a little bit later. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Ed Eilert, our commissioner. He's going to start things off and tell about his background a little bit. He's a school teacher, etc., and then how he kind of evolved into being a chair of the commission.
Okay, well, Al, thank you very much. Thank you all for coming this evening, and I appreciate this opportunity to visit with you about a subject that I think is very, very important to all of us in Johnson County, especially residential property taxpayers. I started my career as a high school teacher. I taught for 4 years, the last year at Shawnee Mission East, and the subjects I taught, they don't teach anymore for some reason. Typing, shorthand, business law, economics, and accounting. I guess they do have some form of accounting, or at least finance. Enjoyed that very, very much, but back in those early years, I decided I couldn't raise my family on a teacher's salary. It's better now, but still not good enough in my opinion. And so I had a chance to get into the investment business with a New York Stock Exchange member firm, and that's where I spent most of my private sector career over about 40 years as an investment advisor. And I retired about 10 years ago from that business. After I built my business, that gave me the flexibility and the opportunity to become involved in local government. And quite by accident, I ran for the city council in OVERLAND Park, was elected, and then 4 years later was elected as mayor and served there for quite a few years. And when I stepped down as mayor in 2005, I was done with political office, except I ran again in 2006. And, was elected to the county commissioner as a 4th district representative, which Janae now holds that position. And I'm in my 3rd term as commission chair. They're 4-year terms, and I just finished my 1st year of the 3rd-year term. I have been speaking over the last couple of years to any group that I could get in front of, I'll put it that way. I've spoken to all the school administrators and most of the boards of education of the 6 districts here in Johnson County. I've spoken to some of our recreation districts who have a mill levy, and I've talked to small groups, large groups about this particular topic. Going back several years, this theory of property valuation really began in the northern states, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota. And you can probably know why, because of Target, Menards, 2 big national distributors. And back in 2018, January 2018, I read an article published by Standard & Poor's about this particular subject, and their take was that this would have a negative impact on local governments across the country if it were adopted and utilized as a basis for determining property valuations. About 1.5 years ago, I was involved in a conference call. The National Association of Counties, where there's about 3,000 of us, is divided into 3 or 4 different sections. We are obviously in the Midwest, and I was on a conference call with about 20 or 25 county commissioners from Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas, all having questions about what was going on with this particular valuation theory. So it's not new, and it's not only Johnson County in Kansas, it's every county in Kansas who has a Walmart, a Target, maybe even a Dollar General, or any kind of commercial property who chooses to rely upon this hypothetical theory. On the screen is the definition of a hypothetical condition, which is a broad term that I'll use in describing these particular ways to value property. And as it says, hypothetical conditions are contrary to known characteristics about the property, including legal as well as economic factors and other factors. So keep that in mind when you think about this subject. It is hypothetical. It's not real. It's phony. It's a phony way to value property. Now, in the state of Kansas, the Constitution speaks to property, a basis for valuing property as being uniform and equal. Okay? But there are other factors in state statute that allow some difference of legal opinions. I'll put it that way. In Johnson County, let me explain a little bit about the appraiser's office. And it's different in states around the country. But in Kansas, the appraiser is appointed by the county commission, county appraiser, for a term of 4 years. His or her performance is evaluated by the Property Valuation Department, which is in Topeka, a governmental agency created by the legislature. And the county appraiser has certain appraisal standards that they must follow in appraising property. If they do not follow those standards, they are downgraded by the Property Valuation Department. They could be charged with a misdemeanor, pay a $500 fine, but bigger than that, lose their jobs as a county appraiser. So they pay close attention to how they appraise properties. And in Kansas, I assume you're all familiar with this, residential property is appraised by a mass appraisal approach. You look at comparable sales, and it's more of an art than a science, quite frankly, but they are required to look at comparable sales on comparable properties. And I will say this, everybody in the county should have the opportunity to appeal their appraisal if they so desire, whether it's residential or whether it is commercial. And that appeals process, there's an informal hearing at the county appraiser's office. Then if you don't agree with that decision, there is a more formal hearing at the county appraiser's office with a representative from the Board of Tax Appeals. If you are residential and you still don't agree with that decision, then you go to the Board of Tax Appeals in Topeka, which is a 3-member board, and their responsibility is to evaluate the appeals and make decisions. There has to be an appraiser, an attorney, and a CPA on that board, and they cannot all come from the same congressional district. Then there is an administrator who can fill in on the board if one of the other board members happen to be absent for a reason. The challenge is that the Board of Tax Appeals does not have to follow the same process that the county appraiser does. They can make their own rules if they want. And that's where we're at today. The Board of Tax Appeals in the state of Kansas over the last couple of years has moved forward using the hypothetical value dark store hypothetical lease approach to valuing certain classes of commercial property. In Johnson County, there have been many appeals to the Board of Tax Appeals. Probably about 60% of the appeals to that board come from Johnson County. And again, keep in mind that the Board of Tax Appeals can make its own decision. That board is appointed by the governor. In January of this year, Governor Kelly has 2 appointments to be made. And the other 2 appointments come up in January of 2021. So I will say this at the outset, based upon the appointment that she makes, there may be some change in how the Board of Tax Appeals moves forward with 2 new appointments. Now, what is the hypothetical value, the dark store value? Well, it started out as being called a dark store. And that's where retailers, big box stores, say that their property should be valued as though it was vacant or abandoned, even if it's very successful and it's well maintained and it's in a very desirable location. They think it should be valued as though it is dark, which would drop the value significantly if in fact that was the case. Another variation of that is what I call the hypothetical lease. In other words, I'm a big box store and I go in and I have a 20 or 25-year lease on the property, but I go to the Board of Tax Appeals and I say, no. It should be valued as only having a 2 or 3-year lease. Obviously, that makes the property less valuable versus a 20-year lease. And there are other conditions, hypothetical conditions, that they point out. In the appraisals that have gone before the Board of Tax Appeals from Johnson County on these big box retailers, the Board of Tax Appeals has reduced their value by 30 to 40% less than what the county appraiser says the value should be. And again, remember, the county appraiser is following state statutes and requirements that are laid out by the Property Valuation Department. 30 to 40%. How many of you would like to have your residential property drop in value 30 to 40%? I'm right there, myself.
Not for real, not for real, just for taxes.
Right, right, just for taxes. And that's the issue. This value drop is for taxes. In the private sector, this type of appraisal process is never used. If you're financing property, or if you're building property, or if you're selling that property, for whatever reason in the private sector, they never use hypothetical values, and there's a good understanding why. So yet, at the Board of Tax Appeals and other places around the country, they say that this is a valid way to value property. Now, the tax representatives will not tell you about that, what the private sector does in valuing property. It's all hypothetical over here to suit their particular purpose. The IAAO stands for the International Association of Assessing Officers. That's the professional group of appraisers, whether you're private sector or whether you're public sector. And they do not endorse the hypothetical dark store approach to valuing property. And they've said that many times. But it has made progress across the country. I don't know this for sure. I'm told that Eilert, which is the Legislative Exchange Council, has endorsed this. And a recent report issued by the Tax Foundation, I believe it's Kansas-based and endorsed by the Kansas Chamber, also approves of this process. this valuation process. In Johnson County, Target, Walmart, CVS, Walgreens, and Bass Pro were all given this big drop in valuation by the Board of Tax Appeals. And we have all of those on appeal to the court, Kansas Court of Appeals. Arguments have not been presented yet. Probably regardless of what decision the appeals court makes, they will eventually end up at the Supreme Court. It is my view that this approach is completely contrary to what Kansas state statute allows. So therefore, hopefully the appeals court and the Supreme Court will support that idea. Now, David, if we can go to the next slide. What is the impact on those of us who own residential property? We put all the numbers together based upon the current values of those companies I just mentioned that were handed down by the Board of Tax Appeals. The biggest negative is going to be for schools. Johnson County Community College, just on those properties that I mentioned, would have to refund about $6 million. Our 6 school districts would have to refund about a little over $28 million. Now, even the state of Kansas has a 20 mil levy, which is used to support the state funding for our local schools. That's about a $13 million number. So if you look at our education institutions, they would have to refund, I think the number is somewhere around $48 million. Something that most people don't think about is fire districts. Now, we have 4 fire districts in Johnson County. Consolidated number 2, which is Northeast, Prairie Village, Mission, all those smaller cities up there in the Northeast. Fire district number 2, which is Southeast County, primarily unincorporated. They also serve Spring Hill. Then we have district number 1, which is Gardner-Edgerton, and the Northwest District, which is DeSoto and the western part of Johnson County. All the other fire services are provided by cities, not fire districts. But even that number is almost $1 million of tax dollars that they would have to refund. And consolidated number 2 is the biggest number. Now, it's important because those fire districts and the schools and the community college, other than state money supporting education, have no other option but property taxes. So if they need to make up this money that might have to be refunded, you know where they're going to have to go. They'll have to raise our property taxes in order to offset those dollars. If you look at the cities, and again, depends upon the size of the city, there's some pretty big numbers in Olathe, Overland Park, and you can look at the total of that number. As far as the county is concerned, our general fund, our parks, and our libraries, that number is about a little over 17 million for the county. There are a couple of, the state also has a 1.5 mills, which they use for state buildings. And then Blue Valley and Spring Hill have some rec districts. Now, the county, our parks and our libraries have no revenue source other than property tax. They do not receive any general funds from the county because they are separate taxing districts. The county general fund, I think the number is about 13 million for for that. We do have sales tax, but they're all dedicated. So if we were to recover that 13 million, we'd have to raise property taxes also. In sum and total, the total is a little over 82 million of those numbers that I've presented. Now, here's the scary part, I'll use that term. If changes are not made by the Board of Tax Appeals or the process that they use accepting hypothetical value, there's a domino effect all across commercial properties in Johnson County. You're talking about office buildings, you're talking about small shopping centers, you may be talking about apartment houses. If that were to occur, you would have to increase this 82 million by about 4 times. Almost $400 million that would have to be eventually refunded. And where would the money come from? Personal residential property tax. So that's the elephant in the room that we need to really understand and get our legislators to understand that, our neighbors to understand that. As I said, we are not the only county in Kansas who's facing this. Sedgwick, Riley, Shawnee, Douglas, all of those counties and others share the same problem, same challenge. So what might be done? Well, the state legislature could step up and pass legislation that says hypothetical values cannot be used in valuing property in Kansas. I've mentioned the Kansas Chamber of Commerce may have a different attitude about that. That's a big hill to climb for the legislators. The membership of BOTA could change and give us a different view on that question. The courts could make decisions that would be contrary to that approach to valuing property. So those are all possibilities. None of them really short-term, besides the governor appointing new members to the Board of Tax Appeals. So, I've often thought about this, you know, if Walmart, Target, this is almost unbelievable. We had a case that went to the Board of Tax Appeals, a multi-tenant shopping center and an office building. And they tried to convince the Board of Tax Appeals that all of their leases, office building and tenants, was on a month-to-month basis, which would significantly drop the value of the property. Fortunately, the Board of Tax Appeals did not buy that particular idea. But that's what's going on in the tax representatives who are making appeals to the Board of Tax Appeals. Riley County has a bill prepared that would do what I said, and that define hypothetical values, dark store, hypothetical lease that cannot be used in valuing property in Kansas. So Johnson County government, in our state legislative program, we have a position opposing the use of this type of property value in the state of Kansas. The Kansas Association of Counties also has adopted that approach. I'm not sure when our appeals will make it to the Kansas Court of Appeals. Whatever decision is made there, if it goes to the Supreme Court, that's a 2-year process in itself to get to the Supreme Court. Now, what happens if all of this is lost? Well, the county or the school district doesn't immediately have to write a check. The future tax revenue that they might receive is reduced by the amount of refund that they will have to make. So either way, they're still going to lose revenue, and if need be, they'll have to make it up. You know, what I tell those folks who support this concept, what about the idea, I have a 3-bedroom house, the kids are gone, theoretically, I have 2 bedrooms that are dark. Why can't I subtract that square footage from my residence? Or my wife and I spend a month in warm weather down in Phoenix. Our house is dark for 30 days. Why can't I reduce my property valuation by a third? Or excuse me, by 1/12, because it's dark for 1 month out of the year. To me, that makes as much sense as these hypothetical values that they're talking about and that our Board of Tax Appeals obviously has adopted. In the Bass Pro decision that was handed down by the Board of Tax Appeals, they specifically say that they recognize and, in my words, adopted the hypothetical lease approach for Bass Pro. Something else I would share with you, going back to 2008, before the recession, most of the Target stores in Johnson County were valued $72, $73 dollars a square foot. One of them was at 87, a couple of them were at 66. But they were valued in that low 70 range. After BOTA decisions in 2016 and 2017, I think it was, they're still at about $55 a square foot. 8 years later, an economy that's booming, you know, Target and Walmart last quarter had record earnings, and yet their property is still valued in the mid-50 range by the Board of Tax Appeals. I don't know how many of you have looked at your property value in 2008, but I bet it's not lower today than it was in 2008. Mine sure isn't. And so anyway, that's the end of my presentation. I'll be glad to answer questions a little later. And David, I think you have some comments now.